Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Wordfence Live. Today, we're going to talk about an easy to exploit and common vulnerability known as cross-site scripting, or XSS. We're going to go over the vulnerability basics as well as some examples of how these sorts of attacks are carried out so that you can better prepare yourself for future attacks and protect your hard work from these kind of attacks. Stay tuned. We're going to get started in just a moment. Welcome everybody to Wordfence Live. Today is January 19th, 2021. Let us know where you're viewing from. I'm streaming from just south of the Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania area. A little cold and snowy out today. If this is your first time joining us, my name is Scott Miller. I'm a customer support engineer here at Wordfence. And in a few moments, I'm going to be joined by threat analysts Ram Gall and Chloe Chamberlain. As I mentioned, today we're going to show you all about some cross-site scripting vulnerabilities. We're going to show some examples. We're going to go over the basics and talk about different types of cross-site scripting so that you can get familiar with that. We're going to show you also how easy these can be for attackers to exploit. And one reason that cross-site scripting or XSS vulnerabilities are so commonly exploited is because of how easy they are to exploit. So today we're going to arm you with the most effective defense strategy, and that is the awareness. So if you're excited about today's stream, please hit the like button below the video here and let us know that you're interested in this content. We appreciate that. You can hit the subscribe button, and if you hit the bell button there, you'll be notified when we go live in the future. We've been going live every Tuesday at 12 Eastern Time, 9 a.m. Pacific. And we've been doing these shows since, I believe, April of last year. So if you need to get caught up, we have a bunch of these streams on demand on the YouTube channel. So check those out. Now, we are broadcasting to YouTube here, so your comments can be seen openly. We ask that you don't put anything sensitive or anything private into the chat. If you're having any issues with your site specifically, rather than posting any links, go ahead and write us an email at feedback@wordfence.com, and you can use the subject line Wordfence Live there, and we will take a look and give you a hand there. So let's get started by bringing in threat analysts Ram Gall and Chloe Chamberlain.
Hi.
Hi, everyone.
Hello. How's it going over there, Chloe?
Good. I'm in Michigan right now. It's a little cloudy, but there's some snow on the ground, so it's nice. Yeah.
Yeah, it seems similar here, maybe about 30 degrees. Not a huge fan, but I think you like the cooler weather, huh?
Yep, sure do.
What about you, Ram? How is it over there?
It's probably going to be in the low 70s today. So yeah, that's real nice.
That sounds pretty nice. Now I know between the two of you, you found a number of cross-site scripting vulnerabilities in the past. And speaking of that, last week, Ram, I think you and I talked about content scraping and bots. And Chloe, you were out, but you had a blog post come out last week, and that was going over some vulnerabilities that were patched. And I believe one of those was a cross-site scripting vulnerability. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. So Orbit Fox by Themile pushed a patch just before the holidays for a privilege escalation vulnerability and cross-site scripting vulnerability that they both required contributor level access or above. So if you don't have contributors on your site or authors or editors, then you're pretty good from there. Or if you don't have registration. But yeah, there was a cross-site scripting vulnerability in there, and those are actually relatively common vulnerabilities that Ram and I see. So it's one of the reasons why we're talking about it today.
Yeah, I actually just checked, and literally nearly half of the vulnerabilities I found have been cross-site scripting vulnerabilities. So,
So we're going to be going over a little introduction to vulnerabilities. So why exactly are we talking about cross-site scripting today?
Yeah, so we've talked about vulnerabilities a lot in the past, but just to reiterate, a vulnerability is essentially a flaw in a code or a process or something of that nature that allows a threat actor, so like a hacker or something, to take advantage of that flaw. And cross-site scripting is one of those vulnerabilities, and it's actually incredibly common. It's very easy to find cross-site scripting vulnerabilities. They're very easy to exploit, and they're actually very critical when it comes to WordPress because you can do so much with it. And it's often overlooked because you don't really think about all the different things that you can do with cross-site scripting. So today we wanted to kind of show you what you can do with cross-site scripting vulnerabilities, how easy they are to detect, and all those certain kind of things. Rand, do you have anything to add to that?
Just that, yeah, everything you said is definitely true. I feel like cross-site scripting is frequently sort of, I feel like cross-site scripting is sort of
Underrated.
not underrated, not undervalued, but I feel like people don't really treat it with as much fear as
Yeah.
as they should, because I mean, if you can run JavaScript in someone's browser, you can basically take control of whatever tab the JavaScript is running in completely. And if that tab happens to be a logged in session to a site, and then you can use that to do things on behalf of the person who's got the tab open. So yeah.
How common are these, Ram? How frequently are we seeing these sorts of attacks?
Like I said, nearly half of the vulnerabilities I found in the last year or so have been cross-site scripting vulnerabilities. I ran some numbers for 2020, which we'll actually have a report for more of these interesting numbers later this month. But as far as just the total number of like vulnerability targeting attacks, cross-site scripting came in at number 4 by number of attacks. But bear in mind, with a lot of other attacks like SQL injection or directory traversal, attackers have to do a lot of guessing. With cross-site scripting, it's typically just 1 or 2 tries once the vulnerability is known, if they're not like fuzzing for a particular thing. So,
And this is going to be on one of the OWASP top 10 vulnerabilities, Chloe, right?
Yeah, it's one of the OWASP top 10, so it's up there.
Now, do we want to get into a little bit of a history of XSS? And for anybody just joining, we're talking here XSS cross-site scripting vulnerabilities, and we're going to be showing how easy these can be to exploit and how to protect yourself from those. So let's get into just a little bit of the history. When were these initially found, Ram?
so I guess that in late 1999, a small group of Microsoft security engineers at the Security Response Center and the Internet Explorer security team heard about attacks some sites were experiencing where script and image tags were being maliciously injected into HTML pages. So it looks like it was actually a 0-day before it was even officially discovered by Microsoft. And I guess, some of these attacks were, links sent to unsuspecting victims. It would grab the user cookies, and malicious third parties would then use these cookies to log in on behalf of the person they stole the cookies from. And they also found some persistent payloads where the payload was being stored and injected over and over. So I guess it took them until December of '99 for Microsoft to really start looking into it, and didn't really have more info and like describe it in a paper until February of 2000. But yeah, as for why it's called cross-site scripting, it originally referred to loading the site you're going to attack, or putting a link to the site you're going to attack in another site that the attacker controls or has access to, like a forum or something. So basically the attack goes across from the site that the link is in to the site that is being attacked. This mostly refers to reflected cross-site scripting. And I mean, these days, that's still a viable way of doing it. Again, reflected cross-site scripting usually takes some degree of social engineering to work, just as it did back then. But yeah, that's why it's called cross-site scripting, even though it's not actually required for it to be more than one site. So
Now, you mentioned some different types of cross-site scripting. Chloe, do you want to go over some of the different types of XSS that we commonly see?
Yeah, and just before we get into that, just want to talk about what XSS exactly is. And so that's basically taking scripts and injecting it into an HTML page, for example, and that script loading into a user's browser. So it's most commonly going to be JavaScript, but there's other ones like I think ActiveX, and I'm not sure if you know any off the top of your head, Ram, but
Yeah, I think JavaScript is going to be the most widely exploited
yeah.
by far in the current day and age. And yes, as some of our commenters are mentioning, some people think cross-site scripting is just a pop-up. It's not, but that's a good way to test for it, just because it's really easy to get that instant feedback. But yeah, anything JavaScript can do, which is a lot these days. I keep on coming back to stuff like you can run a Windows 8 VM in JavaScript. Anything that JavaScript can do in a single tab, a cross-site scripting attack can do in that tab.
Yeah.
So
We're going to show you exactly what we mean by this too, and I'm really excited for that today.
But sorry, go on, Scott.
I was going to say, I don't think I'm going to have to click on any links or pop-ups from Chloe today, so that is a start. And we are going, before I forget, we will have a swag question later in the show. So speaking of tests, I believe Ram mentioned. So if you pay attention and keep an eye out, you may not have too much trouble here. So stay tuned for that. We'll get that. Now, Chloe, did you go through the different types of XSS that we commonly see?
Not yet. So there's 3 core types that you're going to see talked about most often. That's going to be DOM-based, stored XSS, and then reflected XSS. DOM-based it refers to the document object model, I believe. That's what it stands for. But essentially, this is when there's no request really involved. The data isn't being sent to the server, so it happens through the client-side script. So, for example, if there was JavaScript to search for something and there was no sanitization on that input, you could search for something and it would reflect back. So it's kind of like reflected, but not fully, because it's using client-side scripts instead of the server response and request and response. And then you have stored XSS, which is going to be when that payload is stored in a database and will continuously be executed whenever that resource is accessed. And then you have reflected, which is when it's immediately reflected in a browser. So that's usually going to be like clicking on a link, the parameter containing your malicious payload, and then that reflecting. And then once you change the page, it's gone completely. It's not stored anywhere. So those are kind of like one-time exploits. And Ram, do you have anything to add to those?
I mean, not that much. I feel like DOM-based XSS really kind of confused me when I first learned about it. But I feel like it's easier to sort of understand it. Instead of getting the server to reflect or echo back JavaScript, you're basically getting the JavaScript that's already on the page and tricking it into manipulating the web page so that it runs code that you want it to instead of code that it wanted to.
Yeah, I remember when I was first learning about vulnerability research and trying to find them, I would find like DOM-based ones, and I'd be like, "Oh my gosh, I found a reflected XSS," and I was like, "Wait, I don't know how this works."
Now, speaking of that, is it more common to find one of these than the others, Chloe, in your experience, or are we finding one way more than others here?
I think generally speaking, reflected XSS is more common to find. It's generally easier to create a reflected XSS vulnerability. However, in my experience, I believe I found more stored XSS than I have found reflected XSS.
I think that in WordPress, at the very least, reflected XSS is fairly uncommon in these days for, in a way that, that's meaningfully impactful, but I might be wrong. I think that what you're not going to see a lot of in WordPress is DOM-based XSS.
Yeah. And you will see a lot of cross-site request forgery to XSS, so that's a little bit different. It's kind of like reflected. It's a lot of the times it's also stored, and that's a really good target for attackers because if you find an authenticated like admin one, as soon as they click the link that does whatever action it is, that'll get executed, and then they can do all sorts of things that we'll show you later.
Yeah.
So for anybody just joining, we are talking about XSS or cross-site scripting. We're going over some of the basics and the history, and I believe we are going to get into what this can look like in action. Chloe, anything to cover before we get that, or are you ready to dive into that?
Nothing to cover beforehand. I'll just start sharing my screen, and Ram and I will talk about these things as we show you. So the first one I'm going to show you is just very, very basic. Let me share my screen. Very simple cross-site scripting vulnerability. Wonder if I can zoom in here. There we go. So right here I have a simple PHP file that has a variable that gets that uses a super global get to get the value of that, and then it later echoes it onto the page. So it's saying this is a simple form of XSS, and it adds that value into it. So this is literally one of the most basic examples of a reflected cross-site scripting vulnerability. And I will go ahead and show you what that looks like in action real quick over on the test site. So it would be this one here. And so you would go to reflected xss.php. And so if I set the parameter equal to 1, it's going to say this is a simple form of XSS1. So it's taking that user-supplied data and adding it to the page and reflecting it back to you. And if I go ahead and do something like script alert 0 script, I now get a pop-up block because I injected a script into that value, and the browser is executing that. So that's like the most basic and simple form of reflected cross-site scripting. The next thing I wanted to show you were a couple of Ram and I's finds, just from the coding point of view, before we take a look at how we can actually exploit these more in depth. So let's see what I have here. So one of Ram's finds was in, what's the full name?
TC
for
Custom
it?
JavaScript.
Yes.
Yeah,
and
actually, it was our lead QA engineer who technically found this, Matt Rusnak.
Oh.
I just did the write-up on it.
Okay, yeah, so Matt found it, and then Ram wrote about it. So here is a look at the code. So this is going to be, I believe, the function for it. Where did it go? 1 second while I pull it up. Find the original file.
So we're going over some examples here of cross-site scripting, showing you what this looks like in action and how these work exactly when they're carried out.
Yeah, so this one's going to be a stored cross-site scripting vulnerability. So here is the file that actually updates the option, and will set the tccj update value, which is the JavaScript value. And as you can see up here, we have no nonce checks. We have no permissions checks for the function. So unauthenticated users could actually make this update and inject JavaScript into the site. And then if we go over to the front end PHP file, we can see that it takes that tccj content parameter that is stored in the database, and it will inject it into script tags for you. So it effectively makes the cross-site scripting vulnerability right there. So one thing we're going to talk about a little bit later is that administrators and editors have unfiltered HTML capabilities. So administrators and editors should be allowed to do this. However, when you have unauthenticated users being able to do this, it's bad. It's a big no-no. And let me go ahead and pull up my database for you, just so I can show you that this value is stored in the database. Just one moment.
Is there any way you can zoom in any more on these examples, Chloe? We have a few people that are having difficulty seeing. That looks good. Yep.
Yep. So yeah, this is the example. It's going to say echo script and then that value. And then I'm going to pull over my database real quick.
And with that one, the weird thing is I believe that it like encoded everything so that it was safe, but then it decoded everything so that it would run, except that didn't actually matter because it already had script tags around it. So
yeah. So let me go ahead and I'm going to stop sharing my screen just for a split second, just so I can update the value in the database so you can see what it looks like. Just 1 second. Custom JavaScript.
And if anybody has any questions on what they're seeing or how these attacks are carried out in general, please feel free to send them over.
Yeah, Dave Harrington is asking who the intended audience for this webinar is. And the truth is, I think that there are a number of people, both plugin developers, wannabe white hat hackers, wannabe other hat hackers, but hopefully, on the good side, who are curious about cross-site scripting, who've heard the term, who might have an idea of what it is, but don't necessarily have a good grasp on the mechanics of it. I feel like this is a great way for us to kind of share with those people for how this various ways cross-site scripting can happen and various consequences of it.
Yeah, another good thing is if you're keeping an eye on live traffic and you're watching the blocks on your site, you might be seeing these, on the site a good bit. So it's good to understand for the average WordPress user how these are being carried out and what exactly is going on with these here. What are we looking at here? Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Rem.
Oh, I was just gonna say, and like even if you don't plan on being a developer or a hacker in action,
So I
Agreed.
can't quite figure out how to zoom in here, but this line down here, 241, is the tccj_content option name, and then you have the value that's stored in the database. And if I click on it, you can see that it's alert 0. So it's just that testing alert script. But that's just to show you how a stored XSS will work, as it'll store in the database and stay there. And so that is that. Let me see. I think I had another example of some XSS. Let me see if I can find it.
Now, Ram, whenever you're looking for vulnerabilities, what are you typically seeing when you find something like this? Are you just looking through different scripts and it comes about, or are you looking at anything in particular when you find these?
I typically don't look for cross-site scripting. What happens is I'll find maybe a plugin that doesn't check authentication correctly or doesn't check cross-site request forgery protection correctly, and then I'll find out that there's a place in there that echoes out content that maybe it shouldn't, or accepts content without sanitizing it and then echoes it out later, or prints it but doesn't do any sort of sanitization. And yeah, I mean, pretty much any time that you accept user input, we've covered this a bit in our secure coding practices webinar, but pretty much any time you accept user input and then later display it without changing it, you have the risk of cross-site scripting. And this doesn't necessarily even mean places where you can put a full script tag. This is okay, let's set the font size to whatever number the user put in. There's something called attribute-based XSS, which is a subcategory which can be, you'll find it in reflected and DOM-based and stored cross-site scripting. But you can set the attribute of okay, I want this to load this image, and on error I want to run this JavaScript command, and those are fun. And yes, to Albacos 10, if a remotely hosted JavaScript file is loaded with cross-site scripting code, can this be considered a DOM or reflected XSS? We typically consider that a reflected XSS, though again, that depends on content security policies you might have in place, which if you're running WordPress, you probably don't, and that's because it's kind of hard to make that work. But yes, that's typically considered reflected, but you can do it as stored as well.
When you use the word sanitize there, can you explain what that means?
Sure. So sanitized, and this is not a panacea, it's not an end-all be-all, but it basically means that you remove any tags. In this context, it means you remove any tags that might be dangerous from user input, like script tags. WordPress has a really cool function called WP-KSES, KSES, which is context aware and will remove dangerous tags like script tags and also dangerous attributes like on load and on error, while keeping safe things like formatting and links. It's very cool. If you're a WordPress plugin developer, use it. It's amazing. Now, there are cases like, again, with TC Custom JavaScript, where the plugin you're using already adds the script tags for you, and it's just saying, hey, put some commands in these script tags, and in that case, sanitization won't do you any good. And there's also going to be cases where if you want to make sure that, the user input is a particular thing, a particular number, a particular setting, you don't want to sanitize before doing that. Otherwise, you get some weird workarounds where it's just like an attacker can put in a value that gets sanitized down to a value that checks out correctly, but is actually something horrible. And it passes the check because it's been sanitized before it got checked. So...
Very interesting. Chloe, do you have something loaded up on your side for us?
Yes, so I have one final example of just showing you what an XSS looks like in the code. This one is a vulnerability from the Accordions plugin. It's been patched for a long time now. But this one was actually, it worked as both a reflected XSS and a stored XSS. So it was a double whammy. But let me go ahead and zoom in over here. So it was a vulnerability in the import functionality. So if you go down, it'll import all the contents. There's no sanitization on it. There was no capability checks or nonce checks here. And so when you go down, it will send the response, echo JSON encode response. So you could put cross-site scripting values in here. It will import it into the database. So you'll have your stored XSS, but it can also reflect it back to you. If you wanted to use it in like a cross-site request forgery kind of way. And just to show you how this looks, I'll go over here. I went ahead and created a quick burp cross-site request forgery request, and I'll show you what that looks like over here. So it's form action, sends a request to this URL as a post request. The action is that AJAX action, and then the JSON file is the importing file that's going to contain the cross-site scripting payload in it. So if I go back and I click submit request, you can see that I get that alert box that I had stored in the import file. And it also goes ahead and imports that information as a new accordion. And there's also a functionality to add custom JS, which it does add the script tags for you there. So again, that's just another little example of a cross-site scripting vulnerability in a WordPress plugin and what that kind of looks like in the code.
We're getting questions about what plugin was that. I'm not sure if you're referring to the TC Custom JavaScript plugin that Chloe showed a demo of earlier, or if you're referring to the WP KSS function, which is good for sanitizing, and that is built into WordPress core, and Kathy posted a link to it. So
now, so that covers what the code looks like in action there. Do we have any other demos here, Chloe, that you're showing off?
No. So, and I just want to highlight that the cross-site scripting vulnerability comes from user-supplied data being given to a function or whatever it be, and then the server or the client-side script using that data and reflecting it back to the user and running the scripts in the browser, if that makes sense.
Yep. Now, do we want to go into some of the vulnerabilities that you two have found, or is there anything you want to cover prior to that?
I wanted to take a moment to show you what exactly you can do with these cross-site scripting vulnerabilities, because that's where it gets really crazy and fun and really cool to look at. So we're going to use that first cross-site scripting vulnerability I showed you, the really simple one, just to use that as a template to getting this to work. So the first thing I want to do is get set up real quick. So just give me a moment, please.
this is where we prove the point that it is not just echoing out alerts.
Yes. XSS param. So
Dean Sir is asking if there is a valid use case for cross-site scripting. Not as far as we know. If it's valid, then it's not cross-site scripting. It's simply your code doing scripting that it's intended to do, or allowing authorized users like administrators and editors to insert JavaScript that they're allowed to insert. Because sometimes there is a use case for that, but then it's not cross-site scripting because it's not someone making you inject JavaScript that you didn't plan to, or injecting JavaScript that you don't want on your site.
all right. So I am going to share my screen again. And I'm just going to review again the simplest form of cross-site scripting. So I have my screen. So we have that simple example again. And so I'm going to go ahead and set my XSS param to just script alert 0. And so this is just the simplest form. That's what you use when you're testing for these vulnerabilities. And there's actually several different ways you can send payloads. So I'll just show you that real quick. So you can do image. I wonder if I can zoom in real quick. I feel like you can't really see this that well. Let's go.
I don't think it zooms on the browser bar, just on the actual web content.
I was hoping it would, but it's not going to. So you can do image tags, and you can say source X, and then you can do on error. So you're saying the image source is X, and so if there's an error, you can send an alert box. So alert 0 again for an example, and then close that tag. And that's another example of how a cross-site scripting vulnerability payload can look. There's so many different variations in different ways. The most common one you'll see is those scripting tags, just because that's the easiest to use for testing and just the easiest to use when you're exploiting cross-site scripting vulnerabilities and there's nothing you need to bypass. And so now what I want to show you is how you can use a cross-site scripting vulnerability to inject new administrative users on a WordPress site. And so over here, I have some JavaScript. And so what we have here is variables. So it's going to be var ajax request, new request. Then you have a URL. You have your regex. You have .open, which will open a request. You have .send that will send a request. You have right here, you're trying to match the regex to get the nonce to create the new user. And then you set that as your nonce variable here. And then you go down and you're sending an additional request that's actually going to create the user with an open request. You set the request header, and then you send those parameters.
So you're saying that this script can basically act as an administrator and bypass nonce protection and capability checks?
Yes. Yeah.
Once the script is running in an administrator's browser, it basically bypasses all the other protections that are in place.
Exactly, because with JavaScript, we can grab nonces, we can set variables to nonces, and then we can use those variables and send additional requests. So once you're in that authenticated session as an administrator, you can get everything you need using a cross-site scripting vulnerability to essentially create a user. Does that make sense?
To me, at least.
Is this what we see most commonly with these when these vulnerabilities are attacked? Do we commonly see that an admin user is thrown onto the site, or is it sometimes that, sometimes something else?
It's tricky to say, because if an admin user is thrown onto a site, there's a bunch of things and methods that could cause a admin user to be created, including, compromised credentials. Just because you've compromised someone's credentials doesn't mean you want to keep using them. If you're an attacker, you'd want to make a new user that you have control over. So it's a bit of a chicken and egg problem. One thing that we do see is backdoors added to theme headers and 404 pages.
I'll show you how to do that next too.
Sometimes we just see scripts redirecting people to malvertising sites. They don't even try to use it to, gain control of the site at all. And if, sometimes that's what attackers choose to do. We did get a question of what are nonces, and a nonce, it's not British. It's a number used once. Basically, it's a way to ensure that the person submitting the request is the person who actually clicked the button. Make sure that only the person who's supposed to submit a request can actually successfully submit that request, so that you can't trick someone into submitting a request that they didn't want to.
We had another question about XSS. Can it be used to bypass 2FA?
The way that we have our 2FA set up, no. Because that's handled server side, and it needs external input. You need to actually type in the second factor. I don't want to make a blanket statement that there is never any place where cross-site scripting can bypass 2FA, but a correctly constructed 2FA should not be able to be bypassed by XSS. Okay, yeah, I guess I could see that if there's a script on the page that collects the second factor, it could collect that second factor and use it elsewhere, but that would again take some social engineering. Anyways, it maybe, but not in any context you're likely to use, and not easily.
It's good to know. Now, Chloe, what are you showing here?
All right, so the next thing I wanted to show you is now I have a script down here. What I did is I took this content and I minified it, and then I encoded it into shardcode, just so that it's a simpler payload, I guess you would say, easier to send places. And so what I'll do is
and easier to hide what you're doing, right?
Yeah, exactly. And so I'll go ahead and copy that, and I'll go back over here. And I do want to show you for a moment that there are no users named Hacksaw. Wow, everything is very zoomed in now. Go to users.
Might want to zoom out just a tiny bit.
Yeah, I think so. Oh man. Yeah, let's see.
It's not cooperating, huh?
Yeah. All users. And so I just have admin, con, and sub, which are my contributors, admins, and subscriber. And so I'll go back to the reflected XSS. Okay, and then I'm going to set that parameter to that encoded payload I had. Hit enter. And it should have worked. And let me go check over here. And so if you go to Burp Suite, you can actually see these requests that are being sent in the background that you actually didn't see. So we have the first one that's just a simple GET request to user new. That's to grab the nonce. And then you have the second request that creates the new user with the payload. And then you just have the response that said that it added it. And if we go back over here, we go back to our admin area, and we go back to the users, you can see that that Hacksaw account was created. Yes, Ryan?
Oh, we got a question of if there's a step-by-step process to follow to see if someone has used cross-site scripting on your site. Realistically, if you check Wordfence live traffic, if someone has tried to do a reflected cross-site scripting attack against you, we should block it. If you're an administrator and you get it, you can say proceed anyways, because we don't necessarily want to stop you from inserting a script if you really want to. But if you get that pop-up saying, hey, we've blocked you because of this, make sure it's because you intended to do it and not because you clicked the link in an email somewhere. So yes, live traffic in Wordfence will show you, blocked attacks, and that includes cross-site scripting attacks.
All right. And so the next thing I wanted to show you is something we do see kind of commonly. We don't know if the source is XSS per se, but we do see XSS payloads that do this, and it's actually editing theme files. So I'll show you real quick that we have a 404.php file that currently is just a standard 404 page. And I have my payload set over here. So edit theme. It's going to be the same as that create user one. So you find the nonce for that file, and then you have the request setting the nonce and the parameters and everything. And then you end up with the final payload that does all the good stuff and is hidden a little bit. And so you take that back over. You go back to that vulnerable parameter, or vulnerable page, and you go ahead and post that payload there, go enter. And what's cool about this is you actually don't see anything happening. So like it doesn't look like anything's even happened on your end as a site owner, so you wouldn't even know this is happening. I guess that's not really cool, but it's interesting. And so you go over here and you can see that you have the GET request again to get that nonce real quick. And then you have the request that actually does the editing. And there was one more thing I was going to highlight. Oh, yeah. And you can see right here that those requests are using those administrators' cookies, and that's what makes it work as well. And so let me go back. I don't know if it worked successfully, but I'll just verify real quick. Go back. I'll refresh this page.
So what are we doing here, Chloe? What are we creating with this vulnerability?
So I was injecting a backdoor into this 404 file. Something went wrong in the process. So just give me one moment to see what happened. Real quick, I'm going to
Sure.
stop sharing my screen. But
Marco, sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say, but essentially, it's supposed to put a backdoor there, and you can execute commands.
Yeah.
Let me see if I can fix it.
Oh.
I know what it is. I know what I did. All right.
I was going to say, answer Scott Lewis's question first. And yes, that's true. If a user is already logged in as an admin, then they are vulnerable to XSS. But Wordfence does block any XSS in unexpected locations, even if you are an admin. You can choose to bypass the safeties if you really want to for a given request, but we'll still protect you from reflected XSS, even if you're an admin.
Marco had a question asking if Wordfence has a function that can tell if a user account, possibly an administrator account, has been created in a strange way. And we do have a feature there. Ram, do you have any information on what that may see from testing it?
We do have a feature that alerts you if a user account has been added through unusual channels. Typically, if it's been inserted directly into the database, unfortunately, because cross-site scripting emulates a browser, that doesn't count as an unusual channel. So that's one of the reasons why we have other ways to protect you, like the built-in cross-site scripting protection. Because a administrator created via cross-site scripting doesn't actually look unusual from the server side.
Now, while Chloe gets the demo set up here, let's get ready for the swag question here. So we're going to post a link into the chat, and I believe this is multiple choice. So go ahead and just select the option, and please do not paste it in the chat beforehand here. So once you see the link, you'll see a question asking what script might someone use to test for an XSS vulnerability. You can select the correct answer there and input your information, and we will contact you if you are one of the first 5 with the correct answer. And again, that question will be, what script might someone use to test for a cross-site scripting vulnerability?
All right, so my issue was my local host doesn't allow me to edit the theme files and stuff, and I was using my local host website, so I have it fixed up now for us. So I'll go ahead and paste the payload again.
You had a security feature in place, didn't you?
Yeah. And so I hit enter. I think it went through. I'll go back over here and check. And so this time it sent it. This time now I know that it actually worked. And so I'll go back. And what I'll do is, since this is a 404 page, I can essentially go to any web page that doesn't exist on the site, and I have a web shell. So I know that XXX doesn't exist, and my shell uses a get value. So I don't remember what exactly my variable name was. So let me go check that real quick. CMD. So my parameter is going to be command, and I'll go ls. So that's supposed to list all the files. And so what I essentially did here is I used a cross-site scripting vulnerability to modify the 404.php file in the theme to allow me to make remote commands to the server whenever I access a page that doesn't exist. So I can do all sorts of different things like ls, I can make a new file, all sorts of different things. And so that's one thing that we do see a lot with attackers, is modifying theme files and such. But
so you just went from cross-site scripting, executing code in the user's browser, to RCE, remote code execution, on the site's actual server, right?
Exactly.
Which is like a critical
really
severity.
Bad. Yeah.
That's like a 9 point something or 10 out of 10, right?
Yeah, for sure. But with our CVSS scores, they don't allow us to go that high. But technically, it's a pretty critical vulnerability.
Our CVSS scores go to 11.
Yeah.
do now.
Yeah. And so that's a good example of how things can be modified. You can use the administrator session. And so I did see a question that was like, what is the attack scenario here? So this payload, go back to the file real quick. So if I was an attacker and this reflected XSS.php file existed on your site as a site owner, and I was a hacker and I knew that this file existed and I knew that the parameter worked that way and I could put any payload in there. You then have the XSS param. And so what I would do as the attacker is, let me just make sure it works. Okay. Is I would put a payload here. I would put the script here, and I would probably use a URL shortener for this so that you don't see that payload in there. So throw it into Bitly or something. And then I would send this link to a site administrator. And once they click on that link, that's when the script would execute. And that's when all the bad stuff would happen on the administrator's site. Does that make sense? Ram, do you think that sounds about right?
I think that makes sense to me, at least.
Okay.
Malcolm had a question, I think, if that would be highlighted in Wordfence in a real situation. And I think the answer is if you have the WAF optimized, right?
Yeah. So would this be highlighted in Wordfence? So like in the live traffic?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think you'd have to have the firewall optimized because it's a file that's outside of WordPress core.
Yeah, so this is a file outside of core. So this is just like demonstration purposes. If it was a WordPress plugin or something, for example, Wordfence would definitely highlight it. If it's right, that's right, Ram, right?
And Malcolm asked about the 404 file as well. So if there's a change to the file, Wordfence should also pick that up as well, right?
Yes,
Yeah.
and we probably have a signature that detects that particular malware variant too. So we believe in layered security. We have cross-site scripting built-in protection. We've got a scanner that detects if things have changed. We've got a scanner that detects for known malware. There are layers at work here to protect you in more than one way.
Makita asked about defending against these, and I believe we're going to talk a little bit about that here momentarily, right, Chloe?
Yeah. So
okay, go ahead.
I was just going to say, so this is a 404 file that got edited. And then if we go to Wordfence and run a scan, it will say one of these score files has changed. And then you'll be able to see that this exact line was in there. And you'll be able to fix it. But Wordfence does have cross-site scripting protection built in with our built-in XSS protection. And then we also create custom WAF rules for vulnerabilities that are discovered that perhaps can bypass our built-in XSS protection. I did want to show how that works in just a little bit. I was going to show you a couple more examples of how XSS can be exploited, but we are running a little low on time. So I'll just tell you about them real quick. So you can also do things like malicious redirects. So you can do script to redirect to any other site out there. I think we see that kind of often.
I feel like they're less popular via cross-site scripting than they used to be. I feel like usually it's options updates that get used for that. Now cross-site scripting is more frequently used to embed backdoors or add users.
Yeah, I think you're right. And then you can also steal cookies from sites. So you can essentially do the same thing as creating a new administrator, but instead you're stealing the cookies from the administrator, and then you can just use those to log into a site. And there's so many other different ways that cross-site scripting can be used. There's something called Beef, which is a browser exploitation.
It's browser exploitation framework. Yeah, the extra E is just there because they wanted it to sound. They wanted it to be beef, and they didn't really care how it worked.
Oh, okay, I was wondering. I was like, I'm missing something. And so basically, you can hook into someone's browser, and you can do all sorts of different crazy things. And so, cross-site scripting vulnerabilities are very serious. They can do so many different things, and they are relatively common. So it's very important you understand how they work, what they can do, and why you need to protect yourself against them.
Real quick, I want to cover a question we got a while back from Christine Hilary about the result from website test, the one where it says high severity content security policy. So this is I'm not going to get too much into this. Content security policies in this context, their primary purpose is to protect you from cross-site scripting. It is very difficult to get one working with WordPress due to the variety of plugins and scripts and the degree of manual configuration that's required to get one working. But that is their purpose. They are meant to protect you from cross-site scripting. Our firewall rules do a really good job as an alternative. Hopefully someday it will be possible to also have content security policies running correctly on WordPress without breaking everything. It's something that, good minds are working on. But for the time being, as far as on a WordPress site goes, our cross-site scripting protection is probably your best bet. So, don't worry about content security policy for the time being until a good solution comes out for that on WordPress sites. If you're building a site from scratch or any sort of non-dynamic site, then yes, that is the accepted best practice solution to preventing cross-site scripting. Even then, it's not 100% foolproof, but I'm saying if you see that result on a WordPress site, don't freak out because not a lot of people have gotten it working at the moment.
Now, we just went over some of what it looks like and how hackers are using these XSS vulnerabilities, and we showed some simple ways to test and inject a new administrator user and create a backdoor. Chloe, what do you want to go over? We got 9 minutes. Do you want to talk about some of the things that you and Ram have found, or do we want to jump into the best ways for site owners to protect themselves?
I think we should just skip over what we found. We've already discussed how important these are, a couple that we have found in the past. So now we need to talk about how you as a site owner can protect yourself against these. And just to show you real quick, I have Wordfence pulled up. I have it enabled. Previously, while I was showing you those vulnerabilities being exploited, I did not have Wordfence enabled, and that's why it was working. But now that I have Wordfence enabled, you will see that it gets blocked. So let me go ahead and share my screen. So we have the web application firewall enabled and protecting. I have extended protection on. And if we go ahead and go here, and I go to reflected XSS param equals script. Oops. You'll see that it gets blocked by Wordfence. So this is one of a really important firewall rule that we have for you. It's both free and premium users that get this rule, and it protects probably a vast majority of the cross-site scripting rule or vulnerabilities that come out in WordPress. Would you say almost all of them, Ram?
Anytime we find one that it doesn't cover, we write a separate rule to cover it. So yes, there's going to be exceptions. We get on those usually the same day and release a rule to cover them. So yeah.
Always super quick.
Yeah, and as you can see, there's a little thing that says, I am certain this is a false positive. That's there for, there's going to be a few cases where a plugin like the TC custom JavaScript thing or, something else where you're an administrator and you might want to add JavaScript. Now we've already automatically got a set of places where it's normal for an administrator to add scripts, and WordPress takes care of sanitizing any unauthorized attempts. But every now and then we miss something. So if you really need to add JavaScript as an administrator, you can say, I'm certain this is a false positive, and we won't stop you.
And another thing I'd like to highlight real quickly is that you do see these pop up in the live traffic feed. You see that we have this was blocked by the firewall for cross-site scripting. We do block admins for certain things because we showed you how admin cookies and stuff can be used with cross-site scripting vulnerabilities to do really bad things. So you will see these in here, blocked by firewall. If it's a custom rule we created, you'll see blocked by firewall for... Do you know the verbiage or how we say that there, Ram?
Blocked by firewall for XSS cross-site scripting. And in this case, it says query string, but it should say post body if it's in the post body. So.
And then if it's a custom rule, so like the TC custom.
Yeah. There's going to be a few where it just says rule 197 or something. Those are rules where basically we sort of disguise how they work because they haven't necessarily been patched yet, or for other reasons where we don't necessarily want attackers getting too much information on how to exploit them until they're reasonably safe. So you might see those, but for the most time, it'll tell you what vulnerable plugin was attacked and how.
So as we saw there, Wordfence is great with its free and premium rules to help keep you safe from these. Are there any other recommendations? Of course, it's always a good idea to get everything updated, especially if you have abandoned or way out of date plugins. Take a look at those as those can often be a source for an issue there. But is there anything else we recommend?
As far as from a site owner side, Wordfence is probably a fairly good tool against cross-site scripting in particular. There are certain things you can do on the server side that can help, but a lot of them are going to be rather generic. And again, it doesn't hurt to have layered protection, but for cross-site scripting in particular, as far as on WordPress, Wordfence is, I'd like to say we're pretty much where it's at. And yes, security headers can help for, especially for sites that aren't running WordPress. But with everything, there's always going to be different layers going on. You want to make sure that you block cross-site scripting attempts, but you also want to make sure that, you're checking for any suspicious input in other ways. You want to make sure that you're sanitizing output if you're a plugin developer. You want to make sure that, you check to see if files have changed. Don't count on any single protection, but once you add together a bunch of protections, you end up with a reasonably safe solution.
Another thing to check for, as we mentioned earlier, if your firewall is not optimized, you can go ahead and go through the prompts there and get that optimized pretty quickly. Now, our swag question earlier was what script might someone use to test for an XSS vulnerability? Chloe, can you go ahead and give us the answer there while we show our swag winners, if we have a graphic for that? The swag winners are Daniel, Andrew Clayton, Tim, Hristo Lakov, and Scott Lewis. Chloe, what was the answer for that? I believe we showed maybe a few, but there was one that was that stood out there.
Yeah, the answer for that one was the script tags with the alert parentheses and the final script tag at the end. And then just real quick, I did want to show you that I ran a scan in the background, and I wanted to show you that Wordfence does show you that that site or the file was modified and it is malicious. And you can click the view differences, and you can see what was modified. And so I just wanted to highlight that real quick, that if for some odd reason your site gets compromised by a cross-site scripting vulnerability, or any vulnerability, in fact, Wordfence will alert you to those modified files, and you can take actions to clean them using Wordfence.
Sounds good. So did we miss anything before we clock out here? Ram, Chloe, can you think of anything?
I just want to say that I really enjoy Kathy's comment that the winning answer was not the blink tag.
Yeah.
It's good to know. Good to know.
But it is probably possible to do a cross-site scripting attack that embeds a dancing baby GIF.
Chloe might get one of those going for us for next time, and I'm sure I can click on something bad and have it happen. So if you missed it last week, Chloe had a new blog post out, and we've had a few since then. We didn't talk too much about it, but that had an XSS vulnerability in it. So if you get a chance, you can go over to the blog and check out that post. If you're not already, go ahead and get subscribed to the mailing list. That's at the bottom of the wordfence.com page. You can click mailing list. You'll see the blog and the mailing list. You'll also see the podcast down there that you can check out. Ram, I believe you just had episode 100 on the podcast. Is that right?
Yes, though I wasn't on episode 100. We had a special guest. It was Mark. The special guest was Mark. Please listen to it. It's actually a really compelling story, and about how even very infosec savvy people can be effectively socially engineered if they're not careful. So go listen. It's pretty scary.
For anybody who is not using fast or slow right now, RAM, or might not be sure what it is, can you give us just a little idea of what that is and what they can use it for?
So fast or slow is our tool for testing your website speed, since website speed is pretty important for a bunch of things, not just search engine optimization, though it's really important for that too, but it's also really important to make sure that, people who visit your site don't leave in boredom after waiting, 10 to 15 seconds for the site to load. So it's pretty important for user experience. And we test it from 18 different locations worldwide so that, you can make sure that, users across the pond aren't going to hate your site just because you happen to have it on a single data center in, I don't know, someplace with slow internet.
A lot of cool metrics on fast or slow. So if you have a site right now that's ready to go, you can head over, put the URL in there. If you enjoyed this content, if you liked the demos that Chloe and Ram showed and the information, please hit the like button below the video here. You can also subscribe. We go live each Tuesday at noon Eastern time, 9 a.m. Pacific. If you hit the bell, you'll be notified when we go live or whenever we post any new videos. We post some walkthroughs here and there, setting up different features. One of the ones that we recently did was for Wordfence Central Teams. If you're not currently using Wordfence Central, you can go over and add your sites there. If you have Wordfence on them, you can monitor all of your sites from one place. If you have a team that does that sort of thing, you can set up a new team in Wordfence Central. It's very easy to do. You can send invites out in less than a minute. Very easy to set up. So go ahead and hit the like button below the video here and subscribe, because we'll be back next week. Chloe, Ram, anything before we go?
Thanks for watching.
Yeah, thank you, everyone.
We appreciate it. We'll see you guys next week, and have a good rest of the week. We'll see you soon. Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.